Hello. Welcome back to this lecture on the first part of your book. It's almost always the first part of every American government textbook. That we're going to be talking about the Constitution process and the kind of political culture of the U.S. And this will serve as a lecture, I believe, on the entire module. So you only need to watch this one in addition to the enrichment video that I'm also requiring you to watch. So just this and your other work that I've assigned you. So, welcome to this discussion of national principles of the U.S. And just to refresh your memory, we're in the third module of American government here. And so much of our national political culture is centered around the Constitution that we need to spend at least this one module on it. We've already done one module on kind of checks and balances between the branches. This is somewhat of a revisiting of that, a small one, but it's more than that. It's why there has been this political culture that's emerged between the three branches in all the different states. So in addition to that, I want to talk about how the Constitution emerged the way that it did. I want to go over these concepts on the board here today. The first thing I want to acknowledge is to expand on something that I talk about elsewhere in the course. It's that James Madison, the author in many ways, the principal author of the U.S. Constitution, is someone who took such copious notes that were found after his death that they are now the definitive kind of history of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. It just seemed like he was writing all the time. He was transcribing almost everything that was said by every speaker at the convention over those months in the summer of 1787, which, as I said, was not even known by anyone until after his death, roughly 50 years later. And in terms of political culture also, I want to add that he exemplified the kind of educated plantation owner class who, actually did enslave Black Africans and their descendants and was a white male during this time. And he did not at all seek to change that system while he was writing the Constitution or really during much of his career. There is one thing that is somewhat of a bright spot in that in that history that I'll go into shortly. But by and large, he was really of that class and not one who sought to really change the world in any way, but sought to preserve as much of that system as possible. So from that perspective, we don't want to proclaim him any kind of saint, and I apologize if any of my lecture here implies that he was some kind of gifted genius. He was a very practical politician and gifted writer, but I don't know that I should say that anything more than that. But he certainly was a pivotal figure in the development of this entire system. So that'll be noted here throughout. So he used these notes and that understanding he had, certainly in a way that was constructive for writing the Constitution itself, and then also for really selling the Constitution to the public as it existed at that time. He and another participant in the convention, Alexander Hamilton, as well as a third person who played somewhat of a lesser role, John Jay, but mostly Hamilton and Madison, wrote this series of what were called the Federalist Papers. They wrote them anonymously, and they wrote them in a way that was destined to be recorded because they wrote them in newspapers. They were there for a specific purpose. The reason we have the Federalist Papers preserved today is because there was a group of people who needed to read them. And those people were the voters in the state of New York. And it wasn't really all of the states. It was just the state of New York, because the way they set up the U.S. Constitution to be approved and ratified and take effect is that the states needed to be the ones to call individual ratification or voting conventions and agree to or ratify this new Constitution. And the Constitution, when it was written, said that as long as there were 9 states out of the existing 13 that ratified the new Constitution, then it would become law. However, the largest states were really deal breakers, sort of, for this large kind of map of the U.S. I don't have one written up here, but you can imagine of those 13 original colonies that became states, New York and Virginia were geographically and in terms of population the largest ones. And they were right kind of in the middle of that contiguous line. So New York was so large in terms of its population at the time, and so was Virginia, that they served as geographic barriers to the rest of the states in the South and the North, respectively. So, it would have cut off Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont and Connecticut, really, too, from all of the rest of the country if New York had said no. And Virginia, all of the southern states would have been able, like Georgia, wouldn't have been able to really functionally be part of the U.S. either if New York ratified and then Virginia did not. So if New York had said no, if New York had voted the Constitution down, certainly the U.S. could not really have existed further. Probably the same for Virginia as well. But what each state had to do was to create a new assembly just for that one purpose and elect new representatives in whatever way they saw fit to go and debate the new Constitution and vote, either yes or no. They basically had to create a whole new legislature and hold elections and hold a session in 1 year just to vote on this one item, which of course was important. So in New York, because it was such a central player in every way, Madison and Hamilton decided to do a kind of media blitz. But the media in those days wasn't radio and TV and internet, it was just newspapers. So every time there was a newspaper published during those several months in 1788, you saw a new justification of some aspect of the Constitution written by one of the principal authors. And so the Federalist Papers today are seen as just this long work. There were 85 of them, basically essays on individual topics related to the Constitution. So if you include the Federalist Papers as part of the Constitution, even though the Constitution itself is only, depending on how you print it, is like 7 or 8 pages, it ends up being much longer, 200 or 300 pages or so, if you include the Federalist Papers. And so they're considered, by the Supreme Court, so they're often consulted by the Supreme Court even today. So that's why when we say the Federalist Papers, we're talking about the justification by the authors of the Constitution itself. And so one of those Federalist Papers that was written, and we'll get back to that idea of New York ratifying in just a few minutes, but one of the ideas that Madison had was to reconcile this idea of factions he had seen in Virginia, and especially in reading British history, especially within Parliament, he saw factions developing and he saw factions were just a word for a group of people who were competing for power with other groups, and those groups he saw could never come together in a way that was harmonious for even one entire state. So he decided to create this new government, recognizing that, to quote him in Federalist 10, I believe Federalist 10 and 51, always I get mixed up, but they're both very similar. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. And that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. We must create this system of checks and balances, especially between people in different states. So we don't want Georgia, for example, taking over the United States by itself. We don't want New York even taking over the United States by itself. We want them to have to form majorities with each other and compromise their interests so that we will have a union. And so he used this idea of an incentive to create majorities within almost every aspect of the Constitution, particularly within the House of Representatives and the Senate, to build coalitions between states and between representatives within states. And this is an attempt to overcome something that social scientists later on would call the collective action problem. So Madison's use of ambition, counteracting ambition, is called a selective incentive. It's an incentive to try and get around this collective action problem, that it's always more rational to go out on your own when a group is trying to do something for you. It's almost always more rational when you're within a group of people or in a society for you to step away from the group, let the group do its work, but you go off and you do something else, or just don't participate. And maybe you'll benefit from the group's work. So you don't take a risk, but you still get a reward if the group is successful. But what you won't do is suffer from its failure if you've gone out on your own. Madison's idea was to recognize this kind of way of thinking and harness it for the good of the whole. So in this new system, you're not always trying to cooperate with people, you are rationally fighting them in order to create some outcome that's better for everyone. So that's the idea behind harnessing factions. I want to take a second, we should be taking more than a second to reiterate something I've said before, which is, of course, racial and gender political differences and social differences in the U.S. at the time of the founding were such that, women were not allowed to vote, and of course, that Black Africans and their descendants were not citizens, but rather were, by and large, persons who were enslaved by U.S. citizens and earlier British citizens. And they certainly weren't allowed to vote. They were not allowed freedom of any kind. And one thing that came out of the debate within the Constitutional Convention was about compromises between the North and the South in the Constitution in the neighborhood of the conflict surrounding slavery. One was that the slave trade, the international slave trade, the act of bringing forced laborers from other continents and other countries into the U.S. for the purpose of slavery, was going to legally end in 1808. And so there was this 20-year sunset on the international slave trade, at least for the U.S. as a port of entry for that international slave trade. And that's one compromise. So that was a compromise that was seen as a victory for the North and anti-slavery proponents in the North, and kind of a concession from the South that, okay, we'll no longer participate. We'll keep our own people enslaved down here, but we're not going to participate further in bringing more folks over here to be enslaved. So, not a great outcome, but it's sort of an at least kind of thing. So that's one compromise, and the second compromise, which, by the way, Thomas Jefferson did agree with, not James Madison, Thomas Jefferson did agree with, and as president he implemented, but he was still someone who was a plantation owner who enslaved people also. The other thing is what's often the source of a lot of confusion, and this is called the Three-Fifths Compromise. You may have heard of it. So here's the problem. Between the North and the South at this point, in 1787, they already see themselves as kind of somewhat opposed entities. Let's see, right here. Maybe more competing entities who are nonetheless dependent on each other. So not really opposed, because they were still part of the same economic and political system, but they really were, even then, developing two very different political cultures. The North realizes that it depends on agricultural labor of the South for its textile exports, which was just in its infancy at the time. But still, culturally, they felt very alien to the South because of their reliance on this institution of slavery already, even at this point in history, but it would balloon even further in the decades to come. And so in the North, there were a lot of people who were against slavery. And the slave trade, again, was really the compromise here, but there was something that the South was demanding, which was that because we have all these people we have enslaved in the South, we want to be able to count them in the census for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College to elect the president. And so the North, of course, says, no, we don't want to recognize the people you've enslaved as people. because then you'll just be entitled to more representation in the House and the Senate and the Electoral College. And I'm sorry, not the Senate, just the Electoral College and the House. So you'll be more entitled to representation, but those people will not be able to function as citizens. So how is that fair to anyone except you, the kind of plantation owners who are represented in your legislatures and in our Congress? And so instead of working to resolve it in the direction of saying, well, maybe we shouldn't allow those people to be enslaved, they said instead, okay, South, you basically win. You can count that whole population of people that you don't count as people otherwise, but it'll be counted on the basis of 3/5 of those persons. So the majority you're getting, the majority of what you want you're getting, because you're going to be able to count all of those people, but you're not obligated to free them in any way. So it is a pretty bad deal for pretty much everyone except the kind of white plantation owners. But that was the compromise. But basically, it was the South winning. They got more representation in the House and the Electoral College, even though they had no obligation to treat their persons they're recognizing as persons. Another compromise was the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan being merged into the Connecticut Plan, or the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise was simply grafting most of the Virginia Plan onto the New Jersey Plan. New Jersey wanted the House and the Senate to be based on states, and Virginia wanted it to be the House and the Senate both to be based on population. So New Jersey really just wanted to stick with everything the way it was, and maybe add another house, but it was all state-based. So these were two very different positions. And Virginia, it was called the Virginia Plan because Madison from Virginia was the one who wrote it. And New Jersey was just, kind of a counter-argument from the delegate from New Jersey. Roger Sherman was the Connecticut representative, and so it's sometimes called the Sherman Compromise, but mostly the Connecticut Compromise. His idea that he expressed in New Jersey was, why don't we just say that the second house will be based on states, and you'll still get pretty much this whole idea, and you, Madison, will still get this idea of factions and checking each other and all of that, and so on, and you'll have more population-based representation in the House and the Electoral College, but in the Senate, we let them keep their state representation for all these small states like Rhode Island and New Jersey. So that's the Connecticut Compromise in a nutshell. And so one of the things that had to take place in addition to, all the long list of things they had to resolve was this idea of national supremacy. Because as it was, any state could really torpedo anything that the U.S. was doing from the time that it existed, from the time that it declared war against Great Britain and declared independence, 1774, all the way to 1786, really. And so they also needed nine states out of 13 in order to pass anything, and they needed to, for important matters, make it unanimous. So really functionally, any state could veto anything the federal government wanted to do. The Articles of Confederation, were just not very workable. So anyone who wanted to could simply not obey them. So not only could you, as Georgia or New Hampshire or Massachusetts or any state, if you didn't like something that was being talked about in the Continental Congress, you would just you could veto it, or if you decided to go along with it, you could then just not obey it. So it wasn't much of a government. It was more like a United Nations than a Congress or a federal government of any kind. There was no national military, no national treasury, no national roads, no national anything at all. So there was a real danger that they were going to start war with each other. New York and New Hampshire, for example. And that would have made them really vulnerable to their still existing neighbors, Britain in Canada, I should say, and Spain, and eventually France to the west and south. And not to mention, of course, the indigenous Native American nations that were being colonized and terrorized in all of these places by Spain and France and the US and Britain. So at any rate, the Articles of Confederation were a terrible system, and you couldn't even really call it a system, let alone a government. So when they met in 1786 to discuss their differences, Madison was in attendance in that, in Annapolis, Maryland, they eventually said there's too many differences and there's too many problems for us to really fix and resolve this here. So why don't we call a new convention whose sole purpose is just to fix and amend the Articles of Confederation? And as Madison called the business of May next, when we meet in Philadelphia next May, they got there. They all got there, all 55 delegates, and they quickly scrapped the Articles of Confederation early on in their debate, which, by the way, was closed to not only the public but the media, the newspapers, and everyone. And everyone was sworn to secrecy. They kind of conducted several months of debate in the Philadelphia humidity in the spring and early summer with the windows closed. But they quickly scrapped the Articles of Confederation early on, and they said we need to write it fresh. They realized just how vulnerable they were. So at one point, something you should know is that because there was no treasury, no real unified economic policy, there were hundreds of different currencies in the U.S., and there was no one U.S. dollar at the time. It was all just sort of trading in whatever forms of credit and golden or silver coin, maybe that banks chose to honor. And it's also, so it was just a terribly fragmented and precarious economic system, for one thing. But also, it bred an equally precarious military situation because there was no reserve army. It was all just sort of volunteers that were pretty tired from the Revolutionary War. And so all of these people who were, even though it was about a decade ago, all of those people were enlisted people or part of the militia during the Revolution. They went back to their home, usually their farms, and they had nothing to show for it. And if they thought they could get a better deal from, going to join up with someone in another state or trying to take over part of this state, it just became a mess. Like in New York and New Hampshire, they were claiming territories in Ohio as part of their own states. And so that was not resolved really during what was, that was resolved by the Northwest Ordinance during the Articles of Confederation. So that was the one thing they did. They divided up kind of into the modern Midwest, those Northwest territories that they had gained from the British. So Ohio and Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan all really came from the Northwest Ordinance. And so the Articles of Confederation, when they were scrapped, one by one of the things they decided on was that Madison really fought for this idea of national supremacy. This idea that whenever the state and the national government came into conflict, the national government has to always win legally, constitutionally, politically, all of it. You have to recognize the national government is supreme and superior to state governments in every way. And if you don't do that, then you're always going to have this veto of both passing laws and enforcing laws. So you simply can't allow one state to be more powerful than the rest of the states combined and unified. The Elastic Clause was another clause that is often mentioned in Article 1 of the Constitution. The Elastic Clause, right there, says that the Congress must pass laws pursuant to carrying out their existing powers. So if there's anything that could be interpreted as loosely related to something that is in Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, any of the list of powers that Congress has, and that is, for example, the power to create post roads or coin money, to regulate weights and measures and all that stuff, as long as it relates to something, and anything that's necessary and proper to carry out those functions and those powers are what Congress is empowered to do by the Constitution. Let's see. So the 10th Amendment and the 9th Amendment essentially together say that anything that is not explicitly banned or explicitly mentioned as a right, the federal government has our rights are reserved to the states or to the people. So anything that's not mentioned here in this list that I just talked about, anything that's not mentioned here, it's your right to do. To take a walk, to brush your teeth and shave in the morning. All that stuff you have a right to do. Anything that's not listed here, you have a right to do because that's a right reserved to you. Okay? So that's not explicitly in any way taken away by the Constitution. And so the Elastic Clause, has attempted in successive order through every generation to expand the reach of the federal government's authority because the federal government becomes intertwined with the economic and social workings of the U.S. in such a way that it expands its power or its influence to solve new political problems in a way that requires government action. And that is often in conflict, for example, with civil rights. So during the Civil Rights Movement, the Elastic Clause was part of what enabled the Civil Rights Act, which banned the ability of owners of places of public accommodation, that is stores and restaurants, things like that, to restrict entry to customers on the basis of their race, religion, or national origin. The Civil Rights of 1964 was criticized heavily, mostly by people who believed that states should be able to determine what the rights of its citizens are. And states should be able, and this is their argument, to have rights, to be able to create, foster a business climate that allows its shopkeepers to continue this practice of segregation if they so choose. They are private citizens. So that had been going on since 1890 or so. So roughly 60 or 70 years of post-Civil War segregation had been happening. But altogether about 100. I mean, there was only about 10 years there where it seemed better for black folks in the South, but it really, that ended really as soon as Northern troops left in 1877. So the Bill of Rights was this kind of addition. These 10 amendments were written by Madison himself as a member of Congress within the first Congress after they were seated in Philadelphia and actually New York. Is where everyone went for the first seat of government. And it was meant to many as a compromise. It was meant as an allowance to people who had voted for the Constitution on the basis of, look, we have rights, we expect those rights to be recognized in the Constitution. So in these ratification debates, the idea of a Bill of Rights came to the fore. But there had been bills of rights that they stole a lot of language from, by the way, in the British system. So there's about 100 years in the past, there was something called the English Bill of Rights in 1688, and things like the right to bear arms, and the right to not have soldiers quartered in your homes, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, basically the genesis of the First Amendment, and the right against cruel and unusual punishment. All those things that you've heard of were actually first in the English Bill of Rights, so they weren't written or created or drafted by Madison or any of the founders here. They were really very historically contingent and came from really the English Civil War in the 17th century. But because they thought that they had also had sort of a war between Englishmen, and this was part of their historical political culture, they felt free enough to borrow from and steal from the English Bill of Rights and replicate it in their own. But the fear, at least expressed by people like Alexander Hamilton, was that if we listed rights, there might be some tendency to only recognize those rights and not recognize any rights we tend to miss in the first go-around. So we'd rather not write them down. Critics of this would say no, he was just trying to prevent us from having rights, which is why they wrote the 10th Amendment to solve this problem, the 9th and the 10th Amendments, to say reserve powers for the states and the people, and anything not mentioned here go to the states and to the people. But all people were really after in writing the new Constitution was a little bit more stability and a little bit more security for government, and not a return to monarchy like they had under Great Britain. And what most people you'll see afraid of was a return to tyranny. And what did tyranny mean? A return to a kind of monarchy or unrepresentative government that doesn't serve their interests or the interests of most people. At this point, most of the white males who were involved in political discourse at the time were farmers. They were 80%, or I think maybe more like 95% of people were just small farmers and subsistence farmers that maybe some cooperatives, but by and large, just small property owners and farmers. And they did not want to pay additional taxes because they would have had to. I mean, taxes themselves were onerous in that time because there was no withholding, there was no payment system, there was no real dollars. So, how were they? Maybe they didn't have any money except their property. They would have had to sell to banks or mortgage their property in some way. They didn't want to fight additional wars. They just wanted to be left alone. And they thought that's what they got with the Articles of Confederation. So they were happy with it. What they really got was a system of almost total anarchy and vulnerability. The states could not keep order. They could not guarantee freedom. Certainly, they didn't have any money. They didn't really know, at least in their context, what money was at the time. They had no security, and it was only a matter of time before all those small farmers were encroached and invaded by either France or Great Britain, probably. So that's why they needed to do what they did. And I think it's fair to say that if the Constitution had not been passed, the U.S. Could not exist today in the same form, and the Articles of Confederation would be a footnote in either the French or British or Canadian history, maybe. Finally, there's this distinction that often comes up when I teach this course. And when I see people talking about American government and the distinction between a Republican form of government and maybe a democratic form of government, it's maybe my favorite kind of quote that people give each other. They said the U.S. is not a democracy, right? They say it's a republic. So a republic, for our purposes and the way they understood it, is really meant to be a representative democracy. And it's kind of the definition of a republic, just about. So yes, historically, up to this point, a republic is a system of laws that doesn't necessarily rely on popular elections and the franchise, the vote, or even representation of all interests within a governing space. However, this particular generation of founders and group of people did make a lot of references to the idea of democratic principles and natural rights for all. They said mankind at the time, they would probably say humankind, maybe today. So the fact that they were attempting to incentivize representation, which is a democratic idea, that they're really meant, I think it's fair to interpret that their entire orientation was towards a type of democracy. And I think it's borne out by the culture they created or helped foster, which was that there are a lot of issues and problems with American political culture historically, but it's definitely, I think, completely uncontroversial to say that if not, and to me it's self-evident, that if American political culture didn't exist the way that it did, there would not have been at least the germ of democracy implanted in the minds of the founders and the people who understood what they were trying to do. And there wouldn't have been an enfranchisement of non-property owners in the 1820s that kind of spread like wildfire around the states. There would not have been this eventual enfranchisement and freeing of slaves, at least of enslaved persons, at least not in the North. It just wouldn't have happened in the same way. And there would not have been a disenfranchisement, at least in the same way at the, there would not have been this enfranchisement at the national level of women. So what I'm saying is republicanism is just meant to be a historical kind of reference to, in the first place, non-monarchical systems. It's really the only kind of bare minimum they were trying to accomplish with the Constitution. But what they ended up doing was having a somewhat representative democracy that gained representation or claimed more representation as they went forward in time. And finally, there is one more thing I have to mention is that amendments are a different concept here than anywhere else. For example, in Great Britain, there is a constitutional process to amend their constitution, but it's really just a majority vote. So we have at least in the U.S., there is a 3/4 of the states and 2/3 a majority in both houses have to pass an amendment for it to happen, which is why it's so rare. So that's near consensus numbers. And Madison has demonstrated that there's always conflict. So there's almost never that kind of consensus, which explains why the Bill of Rights, if you count it as one, those are 10 amendments. But then 17 times after that, there's 17 times it's happened since then. So those are the only times that we've changed the U.S. Constitution in almost 250 years. So there have only been, in addition to the Bill of Rights, 17 amendments. So that's why we've empowered the judiciary to say what the law is and what the Constitution is for generations. And that's why we have a system of laws that mostly does not need to be amended. Otherwise, we might have to be more like France, who's had, the same span of time, they've had about 10 different constitutions. No exaggeration. Okay, thank you for watching this about the Constitution. I'm sure we'll talk further about some of these questions I didn't address, or possibly ones I did in this video. So I look forward to our conversations, and I wish you well, and please let me know if you have anything further to add. Thanks for watching.